Well, good morning, everybody. I'm honored and proud to have Bart Charlow as my speaker today. I met him about a year ago when he talked at our Temple Men's Group on the same topic. Probably it'll be a little bit different and also the same today. Um, he has quite an extensive bio in the email. But just briefly, he's had a very interesting life, being a third generation in the family that owned one of the hotels in the Catskills, and he's also has been a consultant and executive coach, mostly for expanding businesses and nonprofits. He enjoys painting, and he's been an author. Um, I was also sort of surprised to see that he was the CEO of Samaritan House for a time. Um, uh, my temple, Bethel, makes sandwiches once a month for Samaritan House, and I help out a bit doing that. So I have a connection with him another way. So without further ado, Bart, please give us your talk.
Well, thank you, Dan. It's nice to see so many faces, and Robert and I apparently have some history in common, even though we didn't know each other on the streets of Monticello, New York. This should be fun. You are Economic Roundtable, so I have altered the talk enough that we will talk about money along with sex and food. Is that all right with everybody? Good. I like the shaking heads. I'm going to go through the talk. If you have some burning questions, pop them in the chat, and Steve can then alert me to them. But I'll certainly take questions and answers at the end, one way or the other. So here we are. I am those things that Dan said, and I've done a number of other things in my life. Why do one thing? But I'm here today to talk with you about the Borscht Belt. Now, let's see if the sharing works all right. So I call this talk The Time of Our Lives. Some of you may remember that's a takeoff on the song that was a theme song for Dirty Dancing a million years ago. And this is one of my favorite comic strips from that old era of the 1960s. It's a Wizard of Id about being lost in the Catskills, where, of course, chicken soup was kind of common. So we call this the rise and fall of the Borscht Belt, otherwise known as the Jewish Alps. Now, there were other names for it, the Hebrew Himalayas, the sour cream Sierras. We're talking about the same thing. The hotels that existed for decades, for almost a lifetime, in the upstate New York Catskill Mountains. So we're going to go right into it. So I bet a lot of you have seen or heard of Dirty Dancing, the movie, or Mrs. Maisel, the television series, and they did feature a great deal about the Borscht Belt Catskills, very specifically the Borscht Belt. And we'll talk about what that means in a moment. So in the beginning, we're really talking about the Catskill Mountains of upstate New York. They're 90 miles from the center of Manhattan. And if you grew up or lived on the East Coast, you would definitely know they were there. But if you grew up at any time on the East Coast in the last 400 years or more, you would know they were there too. Because starting with the Dutch settlers who settled what became New York City, it was New Amsterdam at that time, and moving on right through the colonial period, whatever, one of the very first areas of frontier that you would run into when you left the city would have been the Catskill Mountains of New York. You'd go smack into them and you'd have to get past them to go anywhere else. So in the beginning, there were those hills. And in the beginning of the United States, really back to the colonial period, but coming right into the era of when we were our own nationhood, the Catskills, the mountains, were a favorite spot and a favorite subject for artists, for writers, for a lot of things that were in the beginning of our nation. What you see here is an illustration of Ichabod Crane and the Headless Horseman. Probably most of you know that story. That's Washington Irving. You would have read Rip Van Winkle. I'm sure you've heard about that one. Early writers, many of them, American writers, wrote in and about the Catskill Mountains of New York. Washington Irving, James Fenimore Cooper, there were quite a few others. And early American painters too. What you see here is a painting of the Catskill Mountains from the Hudson Valley, and the Hudson Valley School of Painters, who not only were the beginning of United States painting, but were also part of the way that people publicized all of the wilderness and the beautiful places we had across the nation as it expanded. They did it by painting. They didn't have photographs. So they painted these lovely pictures and encouraged people to go out there and look or to settle. The Catskill Mountains were the first subject that they did. They went up the Hudson Valley, they turned left and saw these beautiful mountains and painted some exquisite and well-known American paintings. By the 1820s, this was high tech. This is the Delaware and Hudson Canal. Canals at that time were super highways of the day. And if you wanted to get around, these were fast, these were efficient, and these were economical for moving goods and for people. Otherwise, you were basically going on what were roads, often where people charged tolls, where you might be robbed. And they weren't much wider than about the size of a living room. So this was a big deal to have these canals. And one of them, the D&H, opened up the Catskills to industry. By the mid-1800s, something special happened. I don't know if there are any fly fishermen in the audience, but fly fishing in America started in the Catskill Mountains, in the very streams that I used to paddle in a canoe. I wasn't a very good fisherman, but the fishing was really great up there. And so, as well as tanning and a number of other woodsy kind of industries that flourished, they also started to collect recreationists, people who wanted to come up there to be in the outdoors, in this wonderful, beautiful mountain scenery, fresh air, all that good stuff. And as folks came up from the city to do that, some of the wealthiest people in the United States built what they called their camps up there. Now, if I say camp, you may be thinking of something with a tent, or you may be thinking of, your summer camp that you might have gone to or heard about for kids. Think palatial rustic estates. You got the Rockefellers up there, you got all of their ilk, and they built these rustic cabin structures that Julia Morgan out here would have been proud to have designed. And so as they came up there, other people realized, hey, wait a minute, this is a nice place to go. I got a little leisure, I got a little money, I'd like to spend a little time outside of the city. I'll go up there as well. So the Catskills were becoming, in the mid-1800s and through the end of the 1800s, a really, really popular Eastern resort area. It was within reach of Philadelphia, of New York, of Jersey, of Connecticut and Massachusetts. So it drew people from all over that very populous region. It was a popular place to go. But in addition to that, if you think about medicine in the 1800s, they didn't have antibiotics, and tuberculosis and diseases of the respiratory tract were rampant, particularly in the cities. The only cure they had was to send people up to the mountains, the Catskills being one of them, for the fresh air and the fresh water. So what you see is a picture here of one of the early sanatoriums that became very famous and very popular. This is Loomis Sanatorium, which was in Liberty, New York. People came up there to recreate and to recuperate. By the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, the railroads started to come through, and they made what had been an arduous journey of at least a day to get up there into maybe a 3 to 5 hour trip on a train, which was a hell of a lot more fun for people, and it was economical. So what this stimulated was the growth of resorts. Since it was becoming very popular, people built hotels, they built rooming houses, they built places for people to come up and recreate, spend the day, spend the weekend, spend the week, spend the summer. They were very, very, very popular, and they started to abound all over the Catskill Mountains. But there was one catch to these resorts, and that was that they were exclusive primarily to adult Christians. Jews were prohibited from all of these resorts. They didn't own them, and they couldn't visit them, even though there was a very large Jewish population in that part of the Northeast. So how'd we go from Headless Horseman to Dirty Dancing? This is a tale I'm going to tell you. First of all, let's start with a little geography. The Catskill Mountains, especially for those of you who don't come from back east or don't know back east, they're this orange blob you see on the screen in the lower part of New York State. The Catskill Mountains are very famous because, along with the Adirondacks, back in the 1800s, New York State was had a foresight to set aside these areas as parks, as publicly owned park areas that they set into the New York State Constitution to be forever wild. That was a new concept. Remember, we didn't have Yosemite even at that state. And if you look at that blue quadrangle down there, that's what became the Borscht Belt. And we'll talk about that mostly. The Borscht Belt overlaps with that portion of the Catskill Mountain Park. So here's the Catskill Mountains, deemed to remain forever wild. There's the Borscht Belt. It was really wild, but it didn't last forever. Folks will say to me, what has borscht got to do with it? Some of you may know borscht is a beet soup that's a very popular peasant food across primarily Eastern Europe. You know, when the winters are rough, you got these root vegetables. This is something that you could cook and you could live on. But there wasn't really a borscht culture in the Catskills, in those hotels. At the same time, though, in the late 1800s, pogroms were rampant in Europe and the Middle East against Jewish populations. These were horrific, murderous impulses that the governments encouraged. And what resulted was, for survivors, they started to be refugees and to emigrate all over the world. A couple of major Jewish wealthy families, the Rothschilds and the Hirsches, decided then that they wanted to set up safe haven for these fleeing Jews, where they could, you know, have a nice little farming community and feel like they weren't going to get burnt down by their neighbors any day. So they financed these experiments all across the world. They had one in South America, they had one in Africa, they had some in the Middle East, including in what became Israel, and they had one at least in North America, and that was the Catskill Mountains. And what they did was they had a farming scheme. They would grub stake any Jewish adult who would move from the cities in the East, primarily New York. They would buy for you a piece of land big enough to farm and a horse and some of the equipment, and they'd give you a start. And that was how Jews started to immigrate, into the Catskill Mountains of New York. And they were farmers. But the thing about farming in the Catskills, we'll talk about in a moment, is it was not really a viable business. So you got all these folks, many of whom had never been farmers in their lives anyway, and they don't know what to do. They got to survive. What they figured out was, if all of these Gentiles are going up to all of these hotels and paying good money to have the latest stuff there, what about all the Jews who were stuck back in the city? Well, what they did was they started renting rooms in their houses and renting rooms in their barns. And as that was profitable, more so than farming, they built rooming houses and they built themselves up, just the same way the Gentiles had built up the hotel businesses that were all around them. But they didn't own the hotels. They were forbidden to be in the hotel. About 1905, one of those Gentile hotel owners, decided that he was going to sell out for whatever reason, and he sold to one of the first Jewish hotel owners in the area, and that started a version of white flight for the Gentile hotel owners who left and sold out, basically. So now you have a whole industry born from rooms in the barns now into the actual hotels that were growing in the Catskills during the early 1900s. By the 1920s, this was a real going concern. It was well known all over the Northeast, and hotels were being built and expanded by these Jewish hotel keepers all over the place. And that was the beginning of the Borscht Belt. And what it began was over 75 years of resort culture that was not just for those East Coast Jews, but that in fact influenced all of American culture in ways that most people aren't aware of. So let's start with some economics. I did promise you that before the 6. There we go. So farming doesn't pay well. You got a short growing season, you got stony soil. This is not a good place to be a farmer in the Catskills. But renting rooms pays. And of course, it was less variable than dealing with the weather and the other things that make farming a pretty dicey proposition. So basically, more rooms, more incomes for the most part. And that was the formula. You know this formula. You play Monopoly as a kid, you know, first you buy a home, then you build a hotel, then you build, properties and all the rest of it. That's the economic underpinning of the beginning, the silver age of the Borscht Belt in the Catskill Mountains. So why did people run up to the hills? Well, I told you they were going up to recuperate. If you look at this slightly crowded, this is an actually uncrowded scene from the streets of Manhattan. Um, People went up there for the health and they went up there for fun. As they became more fluent and had the opportunity with money, they wanted someplace to go to. But they ran into this. And as you can see, it was a pretty rough barrier. And these barriers existed all over the United States. So it wasn't just exclusive to that part of the world. Well, here's the Catskills. Here's the Borscht Belt. It started. There are a lot of hotels going up. These hotels are fairly modern. They have electric lighting. They have, all kinds of amenities. They have all kinds of good stuff going up there. But it needed something more to really make this enterprise really rock. There are four things that fueled the heyday of the Borscht Belt. They were crime, entertainment, food, and sex. And we're going to talk about all of those. So, fasten your seatbelt. We're going to start with crime. I don't know how well you can see this on your screen. This is Murder Incorporated. You may or may not know about them. This was the Jewish mafia from New York. And that's what they called themselves. And that was their business, was murder. One of those fellows, which we'll talk about again, is Ben Bugsy Siegel. He's the second from the left. And he was instrumental, as were many others, in both the Catskills and in the Borscht Belt and in Las Vegas. This was good business for these guys. They had all this excess money during the 20s. So they financed the building of a lot of these hotels and the expansion. And it was fun. They would drive up to the Catskill Mountains. They would go to a hotel in the Borscht Belt. They'd have a nice dinner. They'd take one of their friends out, and he was no longer a friend. They'd shoot him in the head. They'd strap something heavy to him, drop him in Loch Sheldrake Lake. Then they'd come back and they'd watch a show and they'd go to a brothel. They had a good time. Next is entertainment. So you'll recognize some of these names. I think most of you will recognize Jerry Lewis down there on the Browns Hotel sign. You got Robert Klein, Jerry Stiller, Jerry Lewis, Jackie Mason, Sid Caesar, Larry King. These were just a very, very few of very many entertainers who played in the Catskills. And that Borscht Belt reputation for entertainers, in particular for comedians, was how their influence spread all over the world. But it actually started with vaudeville. In the center of vaudeville, in the center of radio and television, when it eventually came in, and really to a great degree of all the entertainment industry in that era, in the 40s through the 60s, was New York City. So here it was. Catskills were right there. People were going up there. Good place to go for entertainment. Now, I mentioned food to you, and Robert spoke earlier when some of you weren't on about what it was like in the dining room. This is from my Hotel Irvington. This is where I grew up, our family hotel. This is what I call a small menu. This is a lunch menu. Excuse me, this is a dinner menu, because the lunch menu is about twice this size. So you got to figure this is the American plan. And the American plan has nothing to do with the flag. It has to do with the idea that you get 3 meals a day, all you can eat as part of your hotel package. And people really did eat. So if this looks like a big menu to you for dinner, let me tell you what lunch was like. You would come into lunch and you would find 4 or 5 different kinds of juices. You would have borscht and shav. Borscht, that beet soup. Shav is a sorrel soup that was common then. We had them in these big urns that they would dish it out. You would have maybe 3 other kinds of soup on the menu, hot soup. You would have 5 cold main dishes. You would have 5 hot main dishes. You would have 4 or 5 different desserts, usually cooked on the premises by the baker. And then, of course, you would have all your beverages. And all around your table would be all of these pickles and condiments and everything else you could name, whether it was with sour pickles or pickled herring or all kinds of fun stuff that people like to throw on their plates. And you could eat as much and as many of these things as you wanted. If you were a waiter, you dreaded this fact, but if I wanted to order the roast beef and I wanted to order the chicken and I wanted to try out the gefilte fish and I'd like to see what the Chinese stir fry was, I could order every one of those and I could order as much of those as I wanted. And people did. That's the way they ate themselves silly. The Borscht Belt was famous for the food, for more than ample food. And after people ate a meal like this, the hysterical thing was somebody would get up from your table and go over to your waiter and say, listen, could you give me a little something in a napkin that I could take for later? For later was like, you got to be kidding me. Nobody was starving in the Catskills. And in our hotel, we not only had 3 meals a day in the hotel, but on Friday and Saturday nights, we had a fourth meal, a mini meal, which was a cocktail party with hors d'oeuvres as well as the drinks. Food, big deal. You'll have to wait for the sex. I'm sorry about that. So here we go. We're going from farm to empire. You have all these hotels. Well, let me tell you how much this thing grew like Topsy. In the 1950s, the early 1950s, the beginning of the golden age of the Borscht Belt, the New York Times reported that the Borscht Belt had the highest concentration in the entire world of resort accommodations. There were upwards of 50,000 rooms, not 50,000 guests, 50,000 rooms occupied throughout the summer. There were almost 2,000 establishments, hotels and bungalow colonies in the Hotelmen's Association when I was growing up there. They littered every road, every street, hotel at the bungalow colony, hotel, up and down every road. 1 million people a year visited the Borscht Belt, and that was mostly in the summers. My little town of South Fallsburg went from 1,500 residents to over 10,000 on any given day. In the area that was the Borscht Belt, there would be 100,000 people on the roads every single day of the summer. And these folks are turning over in the hotels every week and every weekend throughout was essentially a 10-week season. So there was a ton of stuff going on. We also had the biggest hotels in the world. Down the bottom left, that's an overhead of the Grossinger's Hotel, very famous. Grossinger's is one of the biggest in the world, as well as being able to have many, a couple of 2,000 to 3,000 guests. They had a shopping center in the basement of the hotel. They had outdoor pools. They had indoor pools. They had an indoor ice skating rink. They had their own PGA golf course. They had ski hills. They had horseback riding. They had their own landing strip, and they even had their own post office and postcode. So it was a rather remarkable thing, but they weren't the biggest. On the lower right, you can see the Concord Hotel, which was the biggest. They had 4 pools, 3 outdoor, 1 indoor. They had a massive shopping center in the basement of this building that you see here. It took 4 parking lots just to handle the cars. I was a car hop there briefly. And they would house between 3,500 and 5,000 guests per night. And both those hotels were running all year long. They weren't just summer resorts. So this was a big deal. So economics 201. How do you maximize income when you got a business like a hotel? Well, the first thing you got to do is grow to have a longer season. The primary season for most hotels and bungalow colonies in the Borscht Belt was only 10 weeks. It basically ran from Decoration Day, Memorial Day in May through the Jewish holidays in September and October. So the hotels that really wanted to make it and grow had to go 52 weeks. They had to become year round. That was a tough deal because it meant you had to winterize all of these buildings, and winter is brutal up in the Catskill. Winterizing meant you had to have covered and heated passageways between the covered and heated buildings. You had to have indoor pools. You had to have all of these indoor things, and you needed to add to it winter activities. Otherwise, why would somebody go up there? Big deal. So you also needed, for 52-week season, you needed to expand the customer base. You could no longer depend on the clientele, the Jewish clientele primarily, who are coming up during that summer season. They began to book conventions from all over the world. I remember when my aunt and then my mother were booking the New York State Lions Convention, for example, which would take over a dozen hotels all at once. And that was necessary in order to sustain those year-round operations. So conventions, singles weekends, high school graduation kinds of stuff, anything they could to fill those rooms and fill those spaces throughout the year. It led to a lot of competition. If I got a golf course, the next guy's got to have a golf course. If I got a ski hill, the next guy's got to have a ski hill. And as you can imagine, those being such an expensive proposition to build and to maintain, only the biggest could have those. But every little establishment eventually had to add air conditioning. And of course, you had to have some kind of entertainment. Even the tiny bungalow colonies would have a wandering tumbler who would come through and do some songs or something once a week. But what we had were 7 nights a week of entertainment and all day long. Sometimes the hotel owners would get together in their association and they would encourage the building of shared regional amenities, or they would grow up on that basis. So we had 2 PGA golf courses that were shared, and everybody used the Monticello racetrack. It was the only gambling establishment around that was legal, although believe me, there was a ton of gambling. And there were other things. There were a couple of theme parks. They weren't very productive. Nonetheless, it was a business, and people were going to find a way to share in that prosperity. So I grew up in one of the hotels. This is Charlotte's Hotel Irvington. Is actually the second hotel that my family owned, but most of my life, this is the one that they owned. And they began as one of those farming families who rented rooms in their barn in Woodridge. They, I think, leased the Hotel Glass on Hotel Row in Fallsburg, and then were able to buy the Hotel Irvington, or the hotel that they named the Hotel Irvington after my uncle. And this was a typical, you can see on the right, upper right, you can see what they looked like until about the mid-1950s. And down on the lower right, you can see what they look like in mid-century modern revision, which is during my lifetime again. Our hotel was what I call a mid-sized family hotel. We were able to, in the hotel, in our 10 buildings, we were able to house about 350 guests. But what made us bigger and a center for the area in Hotel Row was that we also had a bungalow colony. We had 65 units. 65 bungalows is like a small town. And each bungalow really is a house. Sometimes it would have one family, sometimes it would have 2 families sharing it. And so it was a big establishment. When we opened up the dining room on the Jewish holidays, for example, to both the hotel guests and the bungalow guests, we ended up with 550 people at every seating. Remember, 3 meals a day, all you can eat. Quite a package. We also had ball fields. We had a day camp that ran from 7 in the morning till about 8:30 at night. You could drop your kids off, pick them up as you liked, or not pick them up until later if that's what you liked. We had activities going on all day long, 7 days a week. There was a master of ceremonies, a social director. We had an Olympic-sized pool. We had entertainment that went all day. For example, our house band would be playing down at the pool in the morning, the afternoon. You'd get rumba lessons, all this kinds of stuff. We had people running around called tumblers who made mischief with the guests all day long. And then in the evening, we would have a show every single night of the week. And this was Broadway and television entertainment. These were the top folks. Now, we didn't get Sammy Davis Jr. We weren't that top, but just below that level. Jackie Mason was almost the MC at our hotel at one point until the social director wanted the job and told him he beat the crap out of him if he took the job. So Jackie went away, not being a fool. Red Button started at our hotel. That's where he got his start. Robert Alda, who is Alan Alda's father, got his start at the Hotel Irvington. And many of the people who you would know as entertainers in those days, and we'll talk about them, started there. So we would have on Friday and Saturday night, we would have 3 shows. You would start off an early show with dancing to the band and the MC singing, and then you would have a famous comedian, and then you would have a famous singer, They would repeat a second show later in the evening, and then we would have a third show at night. And that show would be on Friday night, it was the exotic dancer, and on Saturday night, it was a stripper. And you may not know the difference. The exotic dancer kept her G-string on, and the stripper took her G-string off. And that's the way entertainment went in the Catskills. We were one of the first hotels to integrate our staff in that area. And believe me, this is long before civil rights came about. And we had so much going on. It was incredible, just incredible. And here's my family. The top left are my grandfather and grandmother. My grandfather, Herman, is from whom my wife swears I got my fashion sense. And these were the farmers who rented rooms, who bought a hotel, and built up a whole lifestyle for all of us. On the right are my parents' generation, the three brothers who were made famous in song by a Yiddish comedian, and their cousin, who was a survivor of the Holocaust, and their spouses. And then my generation down the bottom, there are 8 of us kids who grew up together. We were sisters, brothers, and cousins, but we grew up as one family, all working together, almost all living together at one point or another in that hotel business. So I told you we were going to talk about sex, and we're going to talk about it, but I'm not going to show you any pictures. I know that's disappointing to some. Dan, I'm just not going to show them the pictures, okay? So sex and the country. Well, people came up to the Catskills for a date and a mate. That was a big part of the attraction. If you go to a hotel or a restaurant today, in most places, there are rules preventing fraternization between the staff and the guests. In the Catskills, it was exactly the opposite. The rule was the waiters were available, the busboys were available, the counselors were available, the lifeguard was available, the band was available. It was expected that we would be all participating in romance, and believe me, we did. It was very, very wild up there. The mildest part of it was something like a game of Sexy Simon Says, which they used to play in most lobbies during the morning. But it's the games that they played at night that we're even more famous for. We had something we called the Bull Express and the Bungalow Bunnies. So here's the way the deal worked for bungalows, because they weren't actually in the hotel, they were adjacent to the hotel. They used the hotel facilities, but they didn't have the dining services. They were little houses, and people would bring up their families for the entire summer, the 2-month summer, and the men would go back to the cities every Sunday night. They would return every Friday night to be with their spouses and their kids, who were staying in the bungalows all week. So the men coming back and forth formed a conga line of cars into the cities in either direction, and we called that the Bull Express. The Bungalow Bunnies were the ladies who were lonely and left back all week long with nothing to do, and all those sexy young waiters. I will leave it to your imagination as to what went on, but I will promise you that there is nothing in your imagination that will probably come close to how wild and crazy it truly was. Now, a lot of good marriages made in the Catskills. I don't want to leave you with the impression that everything was extra legal, let's say, but there was a lot going on. It definitely was. There were things like we used to call a key club, and that would be someone would pass a hat around at the pool, and the men or women would drop their keys in, and then someone would pass the hat back around, and you pick out a key, and whatever key you got was where you were spending your night. That was sex in the country. Oh, by the way, going back here, this advertisement, which I love, looking for a bluebird, you might find it on Decoration Day weekend. This is not an ornithological convention. The bluebird is a date or a mate. Now, our crazy culture contributed to all of American culture in a way that most people aren't aware of at all. I would be willing to bet that each of you has used Yiddish words that you picked up somewhere and have no idea where they came from. But largely, they were spread through American culture by the comedians, first vaudeville, then radio, then television, playing the Catskills, And through TV, you would have picked up some of this Jewish culture, know it or not. And the comedians, the structure of comedy in America, pretty much any show you go to, is based on what they used to do in the Catskills. So if you think about the most famous comedians of the last generation, they all played there, believe me, they did, and they spread the word. But beyond that, if any of you have ever been to a Club Med, for example, think about it. Club Med was originally just tents, on islands for scuba divers in the Mediterranean, and they got the idea to expand into all of these all-inclusive entertainment and food and all the rest of it, drinks, kinds of formula that we had in the Catskills. Las Vegas, remember Bugsy Siegel? He took the idea out there in the beginnings of Las Vegas as a major resort area. And if any of you have been on a modern ocean cruise, the ocean cruises in the past, you had meals, you were lucky if you sat at the captain's table once across the Atlantic, and you read a book. If you look at an ocean cruise today, it is pretty much a Borscht Belt hotel on the water, and that's what it's modeled after. So let's talk entertainment because this is the big time, okay? Most of you probably know of Michael Tilson Thomas, but you don't know probably that his last name, family name, isn't Thomas, it's Tomaszewski. And Boris Tomaszewski and Boris's wife, whose name I keep forgetting, were impresarios in the entertainment business back in the vaudeville days in Manhattan, in New York City. And they initially, in the flourishing of the Catskills, brought summer stock up to the area. And so at that point, folks realized that they could get a start as well as a big income boost by playing the Catskills as well as playing New York. Eventually, pretty much all of your TV stars, all of your singers, all of your comedians, all of the folks in that entertainment industry that was centered on New York came up to the Catskills. So what you have here is not an exhaustive list by any means. It's just a short list of some of the folks who got their start or played in the Catskills. So Marty Allen, Woody Allen, Benny Bell, Jack Benny, Milton Berle, Joey Bishop, Fanny Brice, Mel Brooks, Lenny Bruce, Sid Caesar. I remember Sid Caesar well. Red Buttons, who started at our place, Billy Crystal, Bill Dana, Rodney Dangerfield. My father refused to have Rodney Dangerfield more than once a summer because he said, who wants to listen to this guy cry on stage? Boy, was my father wrong. George Gobel, Buddy Hackett, George Jessel, Jackie Mason. You can read down these names if you can see them, and you would be surprised. Joan Rivers, Freddie Roman, Phil Silvers, Alan Sherman, Jerry Stiller, the Three Stooges, you name it. And they played in the Catskills, and they played regularly, usually all summer long. But beyond the comedians were the singers. Again, folks you'll recognize. The Ames brothers, the Barry sisters, Carol Channing, Perry Como, Sammy Davis Jr., Bob Dylan. You ever think of Bob Dylan playing up in the Borscht Belt? Well, he certainly did. Eddie Fisher, who got married up there, Leslie Gore, Joel Gray, Al Jolson, Carole King. You can go right down the list here. Shari Lewis, people you recognize. Neil Sedaka, Dinah Shore, Simon and Garfunkel. I'm not even including all of the rock musicians who played in the later 60s up in the Catskills as well that I saw in our little hotel stages. And beyond the singers and the comedians, you had the athletes. Many of them did exhibitions up in the Catskills. Will Chamberlain, Sonny Liston, Emil Griffith, Buster Crabbe, Ty Cobb, Rocky Marciano, you name them, they were there. Jack Dempsey, Red Auerbach, Willie Mays, Hank Greenberg, who happens to be a cousin of mine. All of these names you would recognize came to the Catskills. So many famous visitors, everybody had to come. And it was easy to come from New York City up to the Borscht Belt. Politicians, we had a president. Lyndon Baines Johnson came up, Eleanor Roosevelt, Mamie Eisenhower, when he was vice president, Nelson Rockefeller. Two of the Kennedys, Bobby and Teddy, both came up there. Pretty much that. And not just the politicians, but world famous American leaders. Reverend Dr. King gave one of his most famous speeches up at the Concord Hotel in the Borscht Belt. And other folks who didn't play on our stages, but they played, this was their playground, came up as well. Elizabeth Taylor, Lucy Ball, Judy Garland, Cary Grant, pretty much everybody who was anybody in the 50s and 60s came to the Borscht Belt. Everybody. And there are movies about all of this. I won't go through all of them for you. Probably most of you have seen Dirty Dancing. I bet you haven't seen Sweet Lorraine, which is a much more accurate depiction of what the hotel life was like inside, and Walk on the Moon, which was an excellent movie about, bungalow bunnies. So there's lots more about it there. So we're back to economics. Okay, looks like fun, huh? Well, this is an expensive deal to do. There are overhead challenges that were growing to be untenable. As I grew up in the 60s, that was the golden era. That American planned food and all of that Broadway and TV entertainment was very expensive. You could only charge so much to the guests to stay. So the profit margins were getting severely squeezed. For those hotels that had expanded, whether it was putting in air conditioning for the summer or winterizing and growing the indoor pools and all the rest of the stuff that you did in the winter, that cost a lot of money, and servicing that debt was getting harder and harder by the middle 60s. And we had competition. There's money in this business. Vegas was growing and stealing guests. The Caribbean was starting to grow as a place that was accessible to a lot of the Eastern United States. It wasn't easy to be in the hotel business, but we were still at the golden age. So people say, why the decline? Well, it did decline. By the mid-1950s, the mid-1960s, there started to be a peak in terms of how many guests came up to the hotels and the bungalow colonies in the summer, and then a decline. In our hotel, for example, we were peaking in 1965. In 1966, there was a little softness in the bungalow and hotel market. By 1969, at the end of the summer, my sister, who was still there, tells me that they were laying off the band and the camp director, that things were almost empty in the dining room. By the early 1970s, most of these hotel businesses were out of business. They were bankrupt, they were burnt down, or they were just decaying to dust. And it was an incredible precipitative fall. And there are a few reasons. First, the economics. If you're charging people $35 a week, this is an old thing. Believe me, in the 60s, it wasn't $35 a week. But if you're charging for all that stuff, not that much money, it's really hard. And as I told you, the economics are dicey. But another thing occurred that nobody seems to associate with the Borscht Belt, and it was a major factor. Remember all of those hotels that refused to have Jews, and so the Jews built their hotel business in the Borscht Belt? 1964, the Civil Rights Act opens up every establishment in America to everyone. Now, you mostly associate that with African Americans, and it was a big boon to them, believe me. But it also suddenly opened up all of those establishments that were excluding Jews. And now Jews could go everywhere. They didn't just have to frequent places like the Borscht Belt. Simultaneous with that, jet travel became cheap and ubiquitous. So if you got a choice between spending $300 to take yourself or your family up to the Catskills for a weekend, or you can spend $300 and take a jet to Paris, which do you think you're going to take? Well, you can guess where that led. At the end of the movie Dirty Dancing, the owner, who looks very much like my father, said, all seems to be ending. You think the kids want to come with their parents to take foxtrot lessons? Trips to Europe, that's what the kids want. That was a movie in 1987 depicting 1967. In 1962, while all of this had yet to happen, my father and mother took one of the early jet junkets down for gambling to the Caribbean. And my father came back, and I remember him standing there in our dining room with a sad look on his face, and he said, I've seen the end. Jet travel and junkets will finish us. He was right. Unfortunately, the economics and the opportunities killed the Borscht Belt. And sadly enough, this is what happened to almost all of those beautiful hotels, those big establishments, and even most of the bungalow colonies. Those 2,000 places were reduced to tens of places. There are maybe only 5 or 6 hotels left, and they're not operating primarily as hotels. They're operating as convention sites for meditation society or as rehab programs, that kind of thing. If you think this is bad, this is taken about the 1980s. Most of this debris that you see has reverted to forest. It is a very, very sad end to what was a once very glorious, vibrant, and highly influential corner of the United States in our culture. So I say in the end, there are only the hills, which is not 100% true. There's a glimmer of expensive B&Bs starting to happen in the Catskills because those beautiful mountains are still as beautiful as they ever were. And most of those derelict hotels are crumbled to dust and not really spoiling the view and the landscape. So what I say is this. The Catskills are a place on the map that you can go visit anytime. But the Borscht Belt, that's a place in the heart that you can only visit in the memory of we who lived it. And to foster that, I've written 2 books about what it was really like, and they're a lot of fun. A Catskill Carnival is about what it was like for me and people like me growing up in the middle of that crazy business. It is not about the glitz and the glamour. It's about the grit of what it was like to be a hotel brat in that crazy wild era. And there's a companion book, Pickle Barrel Tales, which is from myself and others that intersected with my lifetime in the hotel. You know, just the wry vignettes of all the crazy stuff going on. It's a really fun book. So that, my friends, is the story of the Borscht Belt.
Wow, that was great.
That was fabulous.